We're going to keep moving on through the different evangelistic methods that have been used over the years. One thing I did not get around to covering in the last lecture, ran out of time, kind of limited about 20 minutes or so because of the YouTube limitations on file size. And so I try to stay below that, and I ran out of time and I didn't want to get started with something I could not finish. So what do I mean by open air evangelistic methods? Now that's listed in your syllabus, and it was one of the things I wanted to cover last lecture and didn't quite get around to. Open air methods would be Cane Ridge Revival. You guys, Cane Ridge meetings, do you hear about that? Where the Restoration Movement got its start over in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. They're not too far from where we are. Here in Grayson, Kentucky, a little bit further to the west, between here and Lexington. So that's an example. Both of the Great Awakenings in America started with open air meetings. People would have these camp meetings, they called them. They'd go out and camp out, and basically a revival, but since they didn't have hotels and things back then, or at least not enough, they would go out and simply camp out and go to these revival meetings. That was a big deal once these religious movements got started. And so it's been part of our tradition, and it's been part of American religious tradition from the very beginning. So while open air meetings are not common now, in fact I haven't heard of one for quite a while now, the big campaign, the revival, Billy Graham crusade in the stadiums or whatever, something of that nature, there for a while they were a big deal. They're not at this moment. And so you're probably not hearing a lot about them. They're probably not being used too much. Some churches still have their revival meeting in the fall. That's somewhat akin to the open air. It's not open air, but it's the same principle. We get everybody together kind of for a big evangelistic meeting. But even those things are going by the wayside. A lot of churches don't do them anymore. Now, I cover them for a very specific reason. They are important historically, and there's a high degree of likelihood that we'll see that method come around again one of these days. So for that reason, I put it in here. We've used them quite a bit in Columbia. At one time, we had rent an empty lot. We had set up a stand of some sort of, platform and portable PA system, and we'd usually have a movie or something to get them in. And again, after we had them in there, we'd, preach the gospel to them. And back in the days when people didn't have a lot to do, they were popular. They worked. They were good. But nowadays, everybody's busy with watching their TV and their internet and everything like that. And so more entertainment is in-home and in a more organized and structured format. And so I think that's the reason the open air is kind of disappearing. And that's okay. Methods were never intended to be permanent. And so if they never come back, well, at least you know about them for the historical value of how the Restoration Movement got started and how the Great Awakenings happened in America that certainly transformed the nature of American society on two different occasions, and something we probably need again if we're not going to go down the tubes as a country here. So that's a methodology. Now, today I want to talk about other indirect methodologies and what they are. And we've got several there that have been used over the years. One that was used very extensively by our brotherhood in Africa, specifically in the country of Zimbabwe. It was called Rhodesia back then, when these missions were getting started, was medical missions. They were used extensively in India as well, and in China. Now, China, all that's been taken over by the government. None of it is continuing. But in India, there are still some Christian hospitals, and fairly popular ones. I was in Thailand. There's a Christian hospital in Thailand, not ours, but some church got it started historically, and it still maintains that Christian identity of sorts, although a lot of the physicians and nurses are Buddhist and things of that nature. But the hospital itself maintains some sort of a Christian identity. The building has, I think it's a cross up on it, and I couldn't read the Thai, but something about a Christian hospital. And it's popular. People go to it because it has a reputation for being a good one. So hospitals at one time were very popular. They were very common as an evangelistic method into very primitive areas that had little or no medical care. People would come into the hospital looking for a medical treatment. And then as they got their medical treatment, there was always a chaplain or an evangelist there that would be sharing the gospel with them. In the early days, they made a real effort to get all Christian physicians and as many Christian nurses as is possible. They tried to train young people to become nurses. It was generally women. Back in those days, it would be the nurses. And they would train girls from the churches to become nurses and be able to make a living and earn some money that way. So hospitals were a thing that have, again, traditionally been used pretty significantly and in a pretty widespread manner, and were one time very common. They're not common anymore. In fact, I don't know of any Christian hospital that's been started recently. In fact, here in this country, most of the Christian hospitals have been taken over by healthcare corporations, and they might still have the name, but they're probably nothing Christian to them anymore outside of that name. The Christian Women's Missionary Society had 4 in St. Louis. Those were all taken over by a healthcare entity now, and no longer have any relationship to our brotherhood or Christian philosophy per se. They're strictly hospitals. So I don't know that you're going to be seeing new ones started again. There are still legacy medical works going on. There are occasionally Christian physicians that will go out and work kind of individually in areas where there isn't a lot of health care or something of that nature. But it's a fading methodology. It's one that's too expensive today. It's too difficult to organize. It's too hard to find the Christian physicians and nurses that are willing to go and staff these facilities. And so for that reason, hospital evangelism, medical evangelism is not nearly as common as it once was, and it is becoming less and less common as time goes by. It's probably going to pretty much disappear, other than the personal witness of a physician or a nurse, for the simple reason that healthcare is too expensive to be taken on and sustained by your typical church or church organization. But it's out there, and it was used, and so for that reason we mention it. Now, there are other things as well that have been used in this way. Orphanage were another one. They are also one that is fading and far less common than what it once was. They are still going on in some countries, a little bit in Korea yet, in Burma and some of these areas in Southeast Asia, in India. They're not nearly as common as they once were. I think probably, unfortunately, the widespread availability of abortion has meant unwanted children generally are killed before they ever make it into this world. And the tendency to abandon children is less common because as families get smaller, a child that does become orphaned through the death of the mother or both parents is often taken in by the extended family. It's out there. You'll see it. There are a few around the world, but again, not common, and they tend to be diminishing as governments take over this aspect of social work or care for human needs. Another one that was common and is still used pretty extensively both in this country and overseas is education evangelism, the starting of a Christian school. Now, at one time, those were all mission field endeavors, and then as American public education began to turn specifically non-Christian and even anti-Christian, Christian schools started to pop up in this country all over the place. There's half a dozen in this rural county that I live in here, and at least 2 of them go all the way up through high school. The others are up through junior high. And so Christian education is still very common and becoming more common here in this country. We run one Christian school in Columbia. At one time we had a school in every single one of our churches because in the early days, with persecution, if a family became Christian, their children were expelled from school or prohibited from going to school. I guess they didn't want our kids contaminating their kids or something. And so we had schools in about every church. They were bad. They weren't very good, but we taught the basics of reading and writing. We made sure people were not illiterate. Then as the government schools began to accept the children from Christian families, that happened in 1994. Not way back in the dark ages. 1994 is not all that long ago. With the freedom of religion in Columbia, we shut down most of those schools and preferred to send our kids to the public schools. That way they could be a witness there and they could influence their friends and invite them to church and things of that nature. They are evangelistic, the teenagers and stuff down there. But we still have one Christian day school, and it's very good. In fact, it's ranked nationally as one of the best schools in the entire country. I think we're like 619 or 614, something like that, and the top 1,000 schools in the entire country of Columbia. Imagine that, a little Christian day school. And we're, I think it's 11 or 12 in the state from the top. So we have a very good school, and we're very evangelistic there. We teach Bible, and we teach Christian theology. Have a class, and we call it ethics, but it's Christian biblical principles that we teach. And we try to make sure that every parent hears the gospel every year. We have a lot of our Christian kids in that school, but we have a lot of kids that are just from the general community and a waiting list to get in because it has such a good reputation. So education still is an area that's used fairly extensively in the indirect evangelism methodology here in this country and around the world. And it's an area that a person can go into if they want. In fact, working in China now, most people working in China go there to teach English, and then they have to go very low-key evangelism, but on a direct, personal, low-key level, they can do it. And so they're over there teaching English, and as they teach English, they try to live and share the gospel. And so education is one that is still fairly common. Another one now that is extremely common is music. Christian music and Christian musicians. Now we do that typically through trying to put out music which is popular enough in its appeal that people listen to it whether they're Christians or not. And we, of course, use it to reaffirm and establish faith within those who are Christian. And so it has both the evangelistic intent as it tries to reach out to non-Christians in an appealing manner, and then it has a solidification or a maturation element too, where we're trying to strengthen those who are already Christian by using music as a way to reach to their heart and speak to their heart and all of that. So music and musicians are a way. There's a bunch of Christian bands out there. They play primarily to churches, but not exclusively. And a few Christian songs have made it on to popular radio, generally in the country western format, but one or two in the rock and the other types of music as well. So it's not common, but it's not impossible either if it's well done and if it's appealing. And so music is one that we still use in the indirect method. Another one would be sports events. And there are, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes is still functioning. And in Columbia, we have groups of American athletes that will come down once a year. It tends to be basketball that comes down there because basketball is fairly popular. Soccer, of course, is the big thing, but I've never heard of a Christian soccer team coming down and playing. But in Columbia and in Villavicencio, there's a Christian athletic group, and they will bring down a basketball team, and they will challenge the locals to a basketball game. And so there in Villavicencio, they'll put together a team of basketball players, the better ones from the different, intramural basketball teams and things of that nature. And they'll get a basketball team and they'll play a game. And the Americans usually try to make sure that they don't beat them too badly or even maybe lose by a little bit. I think sometimes they're not always putting out 100% because they don't want to go and just stomp the locals and make them feel bad. So they try to be diplomatic about it and just have a good time. It's more fun than it is championship or winning. And so they try to be good sports. They try to be friendly on the court as well as off. And then afterwards there is a Christian message, a short one. And then with contacts that are made there, they give those out to the churches to follow up. And so you have sports going as well. Something that I have heard of, I don't know how common it is, I don't know how effective it is, but it is out there. I know one young fellow who runs a Christian computer gaming site. There are these sites where you go on and air combat. You're a pilot and you're going to try and shoot down the other guy, and you're playing on the internet and there's some guy over there and all that. Well, I don't know if this Christian gaming site has fighter pilot on it or not, but he has games there, and it's a site which is Christian, so they try to keep demonology and witchcraft and stuff like that off of it, and they're trying to use it as a way to evangelize. And I know one young lady in one of our churches that was won to the Lord on that Christian gaming site. So apparently it can be done, and it does work. At least it did that one time. So almost anything that's done can be done in an evangelistic manner. If you can use it to draw people in, if it's something that will be popular with others, then it's something that can be used in some way to evangelize. Now, there's probably a few things out there that you've heard of that I may not have heard of yet, especially in maybe the newer cutting edge type stuff. And if you've heard about some methods of indirect evangelism that I haven't mentioned on your chat, why don't you bring those up? Say, oh, I heard where a guy was doing this, or where a church was doing that, or something like that. And let me know about them. I do try to keep touch with kind of what's keeping my feelers out to see what's going on in the world. And so I'd like to hear about things that maybe I don't already know about. So indirect evangelism is where you use some social gathering or social event to bring people in. That can be something like medical needs, educational needs, or entertainment needs or desires. And so anything in those three categories, you're going to find a way to attract people. And so use them. And within those three categories, there are probably ways to creatively reach out to the community. Our local church here has what they call upward basketball. And in the summer, they'll do kids' soccer leagues and t-ball. So those are sporting events. They're sponsored by the church, and they're used to draw people from the community into the church. They're primarily sporting, but they're run by Christians, and there's usually prayer to get them started, and there's maybe a little Bible study or devotional type thing somewhere in or attached to this event, and in that way they're trying to win people to the Lord. So let's use whatever we can. Again, I'll go back to the Apostle Paul. He said, I become all things to all men that I might by some means win a few. An example, he became a philosopher, and he went to a philosophy forum there in Athens, and he got up and he talked philosophy to them. Now, he interjected Christianity in it. He used it to try to evangelize and win the philosophers to the Lord, and that works. I know of a Christian reading room and book discussion room in New York City. It's actually been fairly successful in reaching out to intellectuals. And they go there and they'll all read a book, then they'll go there and discuss that book. And it can be a book on Adolf Hitler. Why was Adolf Hitler so bad? Well, his religious philosophy. It can be, why was somebody so good? Mother Teresa or something like that. Well, it was her religious or Christian philosophy. And so you can do all sorts of things, and whatever you can do to bring people together on a social way where you can have a connection with them. Remember, I talked about that in that direct evangelism concept. These are indirect, but yet they wind up in some way trying to bring it down to a personal, direct level. So those are indirect methods of evangelism that have been used, and we'll continue to look into different areas of and methods of evangelism as we go through this part of our course. Have a good day. God bless.